A Marriage of Convenience, a short story by Somerset Maugham. I left Bangkok on a shabby little ship of 400 or 500 tons. The dingy saloon, which served also as dining room, had two narrow tables down its length with swivel chairs on both sides of them. The cabins were in the bowels of the ship, and they were extremely dirty. Cockroaches walked about on the floor, and however placid your temperament, it is difficult not to be startled when you go to the wash basin to wash your hands and a huge cockroach stalks leisurely out. We dropped down the river, broad and lazy and smiling, and its green banks were dotted with little huts on piles standing at the water's edge. We crossed the bar, and the open sea, blue and still, spread before me. The look of it and the smell of it filled me with elation. I had gone on board early in the morning and soon discovered that I was thrown amid the oddest collection of persons I had ever encountered. There were two French traders and a Belgian colonel, an Italian tenor, the American proprietor of a circus with his wife, and a retired French official with his. The circus proprietor was what is termed a good mixer, a type which according to your mood you fly from or welcome, but I happened to be feeling much pleased with life, and before I had been on board an hour, we had shaken for drinks, and he had shown me his animals. He was a very short, fat man, and his Stenger shifter, white but none too clean, outlined the noble proportions of his abdomen, but the collar was so tight that you wondered he did not choke. He had a red, clean-shaven face, a merry blue eye, and short, untidy, sandy hair. He wore a battered topee well on the back of his head. His name was Wilkins, and he was born in Portland, Oregon. It appears that the Oriental has a passion for the circus, and Mr. Wilkins for 20 years had been traveling up and down the East from Port Said to Yokohama, Aden, Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Rangoon, Singapore, Penang, Bangkok, Saigon, Hue, Hanoi, Hong Kong, Shanghai. Their names roll on the tongue savorily, crowding the imagination with sunshine and strange sounds and a multicolored activity, with his menagerie and his merry-go-rounds. It was a strange life he led, unusual, and one that, one would have thought, must offer the occasion for all sorts of curious experiences. But the odd thing about him was that he was a perfectly commonplace little man, and you would have been prepared to find him running a garage or keeping a third-rate hotel in a second-rate town in California. The fact is, and I have noticed it so often that I do not know why it should always surprise me, that the extraordinariness of a man's life does not make him extraordinary, but contrariwise. If a man is extraordinary, he will make extraordinariness out of a life as humdrum as that of a country curate. I wish I could feel it reasonable to tell here the story of the hermit I went to see on an island in the Torres Straits, a shipwrecked mariner who had lived there alone for 30 years. But when you are writing a book, you are imprisoned by the four walls of your subject, and though for the entertainment of my own digressing mind, I set it down now, I should be forced in the end, by my sense of what is fit to go between two covers and what is not, to cut it out. Anyhow, the long and short of it is that notwithstanding his long and intimate communion with nature and his thoughts, the man was as dull, insensitive, and vulgar an oaf at the end of this experience as he must have been at the beginning. The Italian singer passed us, and Mr. Wilkins told me that he was a Neapolitan who was on his way to Hong Kong to rejoin his company, which he had been forced to leave owing to an attack of malaria in Bangkok. He was an enormous fellow and very fat, and when he flung himself into a chair, it creaked with dismay. He took off his topee, displayed a great head of long, curly, greasy hair, and ran podgy and beringed fingers through it. "He ain't very sociable," said Mr. Wilkins. "He took the cigar I gave him, but he wouldn't have a drink. I shouldn't wonder if there wasn't something rather queer about him. Nasty-looking guy, ain't he?" Then a little fat woman in white came on deck holding by the hand a wah-wah monkey. It walked solemnly by her side. "This is Mrs. Wilkins," said the circus proprietor, "and our youngest son. Draw up a chair, Mrs. Wilkins, and meet this gentleman. I don't know his name, but he's already paid for 2 drinks for me, and if he can't shake any better than he has yet, he'll pay for one for you too." Mrs. Wilkins sat down with an abstracted, serious look, and with her eyes on the blue sea, suggested that she did not see why she shouldn't have a lemonade. "My, it's hot," she murmured, fanning herself with the topee which she took off. "Mrs. Wilkins feels the heat," said her husband. "She's had 20 years of it now." 22 and a half, said Mrs. Wilkins, still looking at the sea. "And she's never got used to it yet." "Nor never shall, and you know it," said Mrs. Wilkins. She was just the same size as her husband and just as fat, and she had a round red face like his and the same sandy, untidy hair. I wondered if they had married because they were so exactly alike, or if in the course of years they had acquired this astonishing resemblance. She did not turn her head, but continued to look absently at the sea. "Have you shown him the animals?" she asked. "You bet your life I have." "What did he think of Percy?" "Thought him fine." I could not but feel that I was being unduly left out of a conversation of which I was at all events partly the subject, so I asked, "Who's Percy?" "Percy's our eldest son. There's a flying fish, Elmer. He's the orang-utan. Did he eat his food well this morning?" "Fine. He's the biggest orang-utan in captivity. I wouldn't take $1,000 for him." "And what relation is the elephant?" I asked. Mrs. Wilkins did not look at me, but with her blue eyes still gazed indifferently at the sea. "He's no relation," she answered, "only a friend." The boy brought lemonade for Mrs. Wilkins, a whiskey and soda for her husband, and a gin and tonic for me. We shook dice, and I signed the chit. "It must come expensive if he always loses when he shakes," Mrs. Wilkins murmured to the coastline. "I guess Egbert would like a sip of your lemonade, my dear," said Mr. Wilkins. Mrs. Wilkins slightly turned her head and looked at the monkey sitting on her lap. "Would you like a sip of Mother's lemonade, Egbert?" The monkey gave a little squeak, and putting her arm round him, she handed him a straw. The monkey sucked up a little lemonade, and having drunk enough, sank back against Mrs. Wilkins' ample bosom. "Mrs. Wilkins thinks the world of Egbert," said her husband. "You can't wonder at it. He's her youngest." Mrs. Wilkins took another straw and thoughtfully drank her lemonade. "Egbert's all right," she remarked. "There's nothing wrong with Egbert." Just then the French official, who had been sitting down, got up and began walking up and down. He had been accompanied on board by the French minister at Bangkok, 1 or 2 secretaries, and a prince of the royal family. There had been a great deal of bowing and shaking of hands, and as the ship slipped away from the quay, much waving of hats and handkerchiefs. He was evidently a person of consequence. I had heard the captain address him as Monsieur le Gouverneur. "That's the big noise on this boat," said Mr. Wilkins. "He was governor of one of the French colonies, and now he's making a tour of the world. He came to see my circus at Bangkok. I guess I'll ask him what he'll have. What shall I call him, my dear?" Mrs. Wilkins slowly turned her head and looked at the Frenchman, with the rosette of the Legion of Honor in his buttonhole, pacing up and down. "Don't call him anything," she said. "Show him a hoop, and he'll jump right through it." I could not but laugh. Monsieur le Gouverneur was a little man, well below the average height, and smally made, with a very ugly little face and thick, almost negroid features, and he had a bushy grey head, bushy grey eyebrows, and a bushy grey moustache. He did look a little like a poodle, and he had the poodle's soft, intelligent, and shining eyes. Next time he passed us, Mr. Wilkins called out, "Monsieur, qu'est-ce que vous prenez?" I cannot reproduce the eccentricities of his accent. "Un petit verre de Porto." He turned to me. "Foreigners, they all drink Porto. You're always safe with that." "Not the Dutch," said Mrs. Wilkins, with a look at the sea. "They won't touch nothing but schnapps." The distinguished Frenchman stopped and looked at Mr. Wilkins with some bewilderment, whereupon Mr. Wilkins tapped his breast and said, "Moa, propriétaire cirque, vous avez visité." Then, for a reason that escaped me, Mr. Wilkins made his arms into a hoop and outlined the gestures that represented a poodle jumping through it. Then he pointed at the wah-wah that Mrs. Wilkins was still holding on her lap. "La petite fille de mon femme," he said. Light broke upon the governor, and he burst into a peculiarly musical and infectious laugh. Mr. Wilkins began laughing too. "Oui, oui," he cried. "Moi, circus proprietor, une petite verre de Porto, oui, oui, n'est-ce pas?" "Mr. Wilkins talks French like a Frenchman," Mrs. Wilkins informed the passing sea. "Mais très volontiers," said the governor, still smiling. I drew him up a chair, and he sat down with a bow to Mrs. Wilkins. "Tell Poodleface his name's Egbert," she said, looking at the sea. I called the boy, and we ordered a round of drinks. "You sign the chit, Elmer," she said. "It's not a bit of good mister. What's his name shakin' if he can't shake nothing better than a pair of trays?" "Vous comprenez le français, madame?" asked the governor politely. "He wants to know if you speak French, my dear." "Where does he think I was raised? Naples?" Then the governor, with exuberant gesticulation, burst into a torrent of English so fantastic that it required all my knowledge of French to understand what he was talking about. Presently Mr. Wilkins took him down to look at his animals, and a little later we assembled in the stuffy saloon for luncheon. The governor's wife appeared and was put on the captain's right. The governor explained to her who we all were, and she gave us a gracious bow. She was a large woman, tall and of a robust build, of 55 perhaps, and she was dressed somewhat severely in black silk. On her head she wore a huge round topee. Her features were so large and regular, her form so statuesque, that you were reminded of the massive females who take part in processions. She would have admirably suited the role of Columbia or Britannia in a patriotic demonstration. She towered over her diminutive husband like a skyscraper over a shack. He talked incessantly, with vivacity and wit, and when he said anything amusing, her heavy features relaxed into a large, fond smile. "Que tu es bête, mon ami," she said. She turned to the captain. "You must not pay any attention to him. He is always like that." We had indeed a very amusing meal, and when it was over, we separated to our various cabins to sleep away the heat of the afternoon. In such a small ship, having once made the acquaintance of my fellow passengers, it would have been impossible, even had I wished it, not to pass with them every moment of the day that I was not in my cabin. The only person who held himself aloof was the Italian tenor. He spoke to no one, but sat by himself as far forward as he could get, twanging a guitar in an undertone so that you had to strain your ears to catch the notes. We remained in sight of land, and the sea was like a pail of milk. Talking of one thing and another, we watched the day decline, we dined, and then we sat out again on deck under the stars. The two traders played piquet in the hot saloon, but the Belgian colonel joined our little group. He was shy and fat, and opened his mouth only to utter a civility. Soon, influenced perhaps by the night and encouraged by the darkness that gave him, up there in the bows, the sensation of being alone with the sea, the Italian tenor, accompanying himself on his guitar, began to sing, first in a low tone and then a little louder, till presently, his music captivating him, he sang with all his might. He had the real Italian voice, all macaroni, olive oil and sunshine, and he sang the Neapolitan songs that I had heard in my youth in the Piazza San Ferdinando, and fragments from La Bohème and Traviata and Rigoletto. He sang with emotion and false emphasis, and his tremolo reminded you of every third-rate Italian tenor you had ever heard. But there, in the openness of that lovely night, his exaggerations only made you smile, and you could not but feel in your heart a lazy, sensual pleasure. He sang for an hour, perhaps, and we all fell silent. Then he was still, but he did not move, and we saw his huge bulk dimly outlined against the luminous sky. I saw that the little French governor had been holding the hand of his large wife, and the sight was absurd and touching. "Do you know that this is the anniversary of the day on which I first saw my wife?" he said, suddenly breaking the silence which had certainly weighed on him, for I had never met a more loquacious creature. "It is also the anniversary of the day on which she promised to be my wife, and which will surprise you, they were one and the same." "Voyons, mon ami," said the lady, "you are not going to bore our friends with that old story. You are really quite insupportable." But she spoke with a smile on her large, firm face, and in a tone that suggested that she was quite willing to hear it again. "But it will interest them, mon petit chou?" It was in this way that he always addressed his wife, and it was funny to hear this imposing and even majestic lady thus addressed by her small husband. "Will it not, monsieur?" he asked me. "It is a romance, and who does not like romance, especially on such a night as this?" I assured the governor that we were all anxious to hear, and the Belgian colonel took the opportunity once more to be polite. "You see, ours was a marriage of convenience, pure and simple." "C'est vrai," said the lady. "It would be stupid to deny it. But sometimes love comes after marriage and not before, and then it is better. It lasts longer." I could not but notice that the governor gave her hand an affectionate little squeeze. You see, I had been in the Navy, and when I retired I was 49. I was strong and active, and I was very anxious to find an occupation. I looked about. I pulled all the strings I could. Fortunately, I had a cousin who had some political importance. It is one of the advantages of democratic government that if you have sufficient influence, merit, which otherwise might pass unnoticed, generally receives its due reward. "You are modesty itself, mon pauvre ami," said she, and presently I was sent for by the minister to the colonies and offered the post of governor in a certain colony. It was a very distant spot that they wished to send me to, and a lonely one. But I had spent my life wandering from port to port, and that was not a matter that troubled me. I accepted with joy. The minister told me that I must be ready to start in a month. I told him that would be easy for an old bachelor who had nothing much in the world but a few clothes and a few books. "Comment, mon lieutenant," he cried. "You are a bachelor?" "Certainly," I answered, "and I have every intention of remaining one." "In that case, I am afraid I must withdraw my offer. For this position, it is essential that you should be married." It is too long a story to tell you, but the gist of it was that owing to the scandal my predecessor, a bachelor, had caused, by having native girls to live in the residency, and the consequent complaints of the white people, planters, and the wives of functionaries, it had been decided that the next governor must be a model of respectability. I expostulated. I argued. I recapitulated my services to the country and the services my cousin could render at the next elections. Nothing would serve. The minister was adamant. "But what can I do?" I cried with dismay. "You can marry," said the minister. "Mais voyons, monsieur le ministre, I do not know any women. I am not a ladies' man, and I am 49. How do you expect me to find a wife?" "Nothing is more simple. Put an advertisement in the paper." I was confounded. I did not know what to say. "Well, think it over," said the minister. "If you can find a wife in a month, you can go, but no wife, no job. That is my last word." He smiled a little. To him the situation was not without humor. And if you think of advertising, I recommend the Figaro. I walked away from the ministry with death in my heart. I knew the place to which they desired to appoint me, and I knew it would suit me very well to live there. The climate was tolerable, and the residency was spacious and comfortable. The notion of being a governor was far from displeasing me, and having nothing much but my pension as a naval officer, the salary was not to be despised. Suddenly I made up my mind. I walked to the offices of the Figaro, composed an advertisement and handed it in for insertion. But I can tell you, when I walked up the Champs-Élysées afterwards, my heart was beating much more furiously than it had ever done when my ship was stripped for action. The governor leaned forward and put his hand impressively on my knee. Mon cher monsieur, you will never believe it, but I had 4,372 replies. It was an avalanche. I had expected half a dozen. I had to take a cab to take the letters to my hotel. My room was swamped with them. There were 4,372 women who were willing to share my solitude and be a governor's lady. It was staggering. They were of all ages from 17 to 70. There were maidens of irreproachable ancestry and the highest culture. There were unmarried ladies who had made a little slip at one period of their career and now desired to regularize their situation. There were widows whose husbands had died in the most harrowing circumstances, and there were widows whose children would be a solace to my old age. They were blonde and dark, tall and short, fat and thin. Some could speak 5 languages, and others could play the piano. Some offered me love, and some craved for it. Some could only give me a solid friendship, but mingled with esteem. Some had a fortune, and others golden prospects. I was overwhelmed. I was bewildered. At last I lost my temper, for I am a passionate man, and I got up and I stamped on all those letters and all those photographs, and I cried, I will marry none of them. It was hopeless. I had less than a month now, and I could not see over 4,000 aspirants to my hand in that time. I felt that if I did not see them all, I should be tortured for the rest of my life by the thought that I had missed the one woman the fates had destined to make me happy. I gave it up as a bad job. I went out of my room hideous with all those photographs and littered papers, and to drive care away went onto the boulevard and sat down at the Café de la Paix. After a time, I saw a friend passing, and he nodded to me and smiled. I tried to smile, but my heart was sore. I realized that I must spend the years that remained to me in a cheap pension at Toulon or Brest as an officier de marine en retraite. Zut! My friend stopped, and coming up to me sat down. "What is making you look so glum, mon cher?" he asked me. "You who are the gayest of mortals." I was glad to have someone in whom I could confide my troubles, and told him the whole story. He laughed consumedly. I have thought since that perhaps the incident had its comic side, but at the time, I assure you, I could see in it nothing to laugh at. I mentioned the fact to my friend, not without asperity, and then, controlling his mirth as best he could, he said to me, "But, my dear fellow, do you really want to marry?" At this, I entirely lost my temper. "You are completely idiotic," I said. "If I did not want to marry, and what is more, marry at once, within the next fortnight, do you imagine that I should have spent 3 days reading love letters from women I have never set eyes on?" "Calm yourself and listen to me," he replied. "I have a cousin who lives in Geneva. She is Swiss du reste, and she belongs to a family of the greatest respectability in the Republic. Her morals are without reproach. She is of a suitable age, a spinster, for she has spent the last 15 years nursing an invalid mother who has lately died. She is well educated, and par-dessus le marché, she is not ugly." "It sounds as though she were a paragon," I said. "I do not say that, but she has been well brought up, and would become the position you have to offer her. There is one thing you forget. What inducement would there be for her to give up her friends and her accustomed life to accompany in exile a man of 49 who is by no means a beauty?" Monsieur le Gouverneur broke off his narrative and, shrugging his shoulders so emphatically that his head almost sank between them, turned to us. "I am ugly. I admit it. I am of an ugliness that does not inspire terror or respect, but only ridicule, and that is the worst ugliness of all. When people see me for the first time, they do not shrink with horror. There would evidently be something flattering in that. They burst out laughing. Listen, when the admirable Mr. Wilkins showed me his animals this morning, Percy, the orang-utan, held out his arms, and but for the bars of the cage, would have clasped me to his bosom as a long-lost brother. Once, indeed, when I was at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, and was told that one of the anthropoid apes had escaped, I made my way to the exit as quickly as I could in fear that, mistaking me for the refugee, they would seize me and, notwithstanding my expostulations, shut me up in the monkey house. "Voyons, mon ami," said Madame his wife in her deep, slow voice, "you are talking even greater nonsense than usual. I do not say that you are an Apollo. In your position it is unnecessary that you should be, but you have dignity, you have poise, you are what any woman would call a fine man." I will resume my story. When I made this remark to my friend, he replied, "One can never tell with women. There is something about marriage that wonderfully attracts them. There would be no harm in asking her. After all, it is regarded as a compliment by a woman to be asked in marriage. She can but refuse. But I do not know your cousin, and I do not see how I am to make her acquaintance. I cannot go to her house, ask to see her, and when I am shown into the drawing-room say, 'Voilà, I have come to ask you to marry me.' She would think I was a lunatic and scream for help. Besides, I am a man of an extreme timidity, and I could never take such a step." "I will tell you what to do," said my friend. "Go to Geneva and take her a box of chocolates from me. She will be glad to have news of me and will receive you with pleasure. You can have a little talk, and then if you do not like the look of her, you take your leave and no harm is done. If, on the other hand, you do, we can go into the matter, and you can make a formal demand for her hand." I was desperate. It seemed the only thing to do. We went to a shop at once and bought an enormous box of chocolates, and that night I took the train to Geneva. No sooner had I arrived than I sent her a letter to say that I was the bearer of a gift from her cousin, and much wished to give myself the pleasure of delivering it in person. Within an hour I received her reply to the effect that she would be pleased to receive me at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I spent the interval before my mirror, and 17 times I tied and retied my tie. As the clock struck 4, I presented myself at the door of her house, and was immediately ushered into the drawing-room. She was waiting for me. Her cousin said she was not ugly. Imagine my surprise to see a young woman, a woman still young, of a noble presence, with the dignity of Juno, the features of Venus, and in her expression the intelligence of Minerva. "You are too absurd," said Madame. "But by now these gentlemen know that one cannot believe all you say." I swear to you that I do not exaggerate. I was so taken aback that I nearly dropped the box of chocolates. But I said to myself, "La garde meurt mais ne se rend pas." I presented the box of chocolates. I gave her news of her cousin. I found her amiable. We talked for a quarter of an hour, and then I said to myself, "Allons-y." I said to her, "Mademoiselle, I must tell you that I did not come here merely to give you a box of chocolates." She smiled and remarked that evidently I must have had reasons to come to Geneva of more importance than that. "I came to ask you to do me the honor of marrying me." She gave a start. "But, monsieur, you are mad," she said. "I beseech you not to answer till you have heard the facts," I interrupted, and before she could say another word, I told her the whole story. I told her about my advertisement in the Figaro, and she laughed till the tears ran down her face. Then I repeated my offer. "You are serious?" she asked. "I have never been more serious in my life." "I will not deny that your offer has come as a surprise. I had not thought of marrying, I have passed the age, but evidently your offer is not one that a woman should refuse without consideration. I am flattered. Will you give me a few days to reflect?" "Mademoiselle, I am absolutely desolated," I replied, "but I have not time. If you will not marry me, I must go back to Paris and resume my perusal of the 1,500 or 1,800 letters that still await my attention. It is quite evident that I cannot possibly give you an answer at once. I had not set eyes on you a quarter of an hour ago. I must consult my friends and my family. What have they got to do with it? You are of full age. The matter is pressing. I cannot wait. I have told you everything. You are an intelligent woman. What can prolonged reflection add to the impulse of the moment? You are not asking me to say yes or no this very minute? That is outrageous. That is exactly what I am asking. My train goes back to Paris in a couple of hours. She looked at me reflectively. You are quite evidently a lunatic. You ought to be shut up both for your own safety and that of the public. Well, which is it to be? I said. Yes or no? She shrugged her shoulders. Mon Dieu. She waited a minute, and I was on tenterhooks. Yes. The governor waved his hand towards his wife. And there she is. We were married in a fortnight, and I became governor of a colony. I married a jewel, my dear sirs, a woman of the most charming character, 1 in 1,000, a woman of a masculine intelligence and a feminine sensibility, an admirable woman. But hold your tongue, mon ami, his wife said. You are making me as ridiculous as yourself. He turned to the Belgian colonel. Are you a bachelor, mon colonel? If so, I strongly recommend you to go to Geneva. It is a nest, une pépinière was the word he used, of the most adorable young women. You will find a wife there as nowhere else. Geneva is besides a charming city. Do not waste a minute, but go there, and I will give you a letter to my wife's nieces. It was she who summed up the story. The fact is that in a marriage of convenience you expect less, and so you are less likely to be disappointed. As you do not make senseless claims on one another, there is no reason for exasperation. You do not look for perfection, and so you are tolerant to one another's faults. Passion is all very well, but it is not a proper foundation for marriage. Voyez-vous, for two people to be happy in marriage, they must be able to respect one another, they must be of the same condition, and their interests must be alike. Then if they are decent people, and are willing to give and take, to live and let live, there is no reason why their union should not be as happy as ours. She paused. But of course my husband is a very, very remarkable man.